Beyondaril by John Metcalfe. Geoffrey Stigton's health had not begun to fail till the preceding autumn, and then it could plausibly have been explained by an unusually trying summer, long hours, and the death of an old and valued friend. Only now, a whole year later, had his tiresome off-colour state become so marked as to occasion comment or concern. "A change, sir," counselled his housekeeper, Mrs. Willows. "I could cope with everything at all likely to happen while you were away." "I'm sure you could, Mrs. Willows," agreed Geoffrey listlessly, but he had not taken the change. He lived, at 50, in comfortable early semi-retirement near Muswell Hill. The house, which had come to him this spring from his deceased friend, Jervis, stood squarely apart at the bottom of one of those select and deliberate cols de sec so popular recently with estate developers. It was a nice-looking little property, Geoffrey thought, though at the moment, unfortunately, its appearance was rather detracted from and spoiled. An immense, unsightly hoarding, as big as the side of a barn, screened what must be extensive bomb site repairing operations in a park to the rear, and bore an advertisement display of toothpaste and cosmetics, the funds from which monstrosity, it was announced, would be applied to some good work of charity and restoration. The eyesore not only obscured for Mr. Stigton the pleasing prospect which was understood and guaranteed to lie behind his dwelling and artistically to set it off, but even, as he turned into Bayard Close from the main road, considerably interfered with his proprietorial and homecoming glimpse of a portion of the house itself. A nuisance, but a trifle, compared with what? He didn't quite know for a while. Headaches, languor, loss of appetite. These were the type of minor ailment or indisposition for which his not particularly interested or sympathetic medico, Latham, would merely and with impatience have repeated his prescription of a holiday, fresh air and exercise, and above all, no worry. It was something different. The trouble, whatever its nature, was less ponderable, deeper-rooted, and farther-going than any of that. Back of the trite symptoms waited a heavier and daily mounting oppression, a brooding, while as yet formless fear, that caused him, through the lonely hours of darkness, to bite the sheets in terror, and lest his groans arouse the slumbering Mrs. Willows, stuff them in his mouth. He wished, or thought he wished, that he could give it a name. Wish it or no, a name of sorts was given. Yes, Beyondaril, at once nonsensical and menacing. These syllables not so much came to mean as coldly cling to, breath themselves about, a curiously recurrent dream or vision, and to be linked, in his imagination, with, of all odd precipitants of horror or dismay, a steeple, stretch of garden or allotments, and slow-running stream. That is to say, with a persistent mental picture of these things together, a physical juxtaposing or conjunction of them in actual space which somewhere he might have seen, and of which the memory, if it were a memory, distressed him. Was it, in fact, a memory? Through the night watches in that half-land of omen and twilight anomaly, in the packed silences of that still netherworld wherein dream calls to dream, each summoning a wonted train of interwoven and attendant fantasies, well worn and speechlessly familiar now, although forgotten and eluding capture in the day, Geoffrey received the freedom of the whole Tom Tiddler's ground of sleep, and dreadingly renewed acquaintance with his vision many times, Yet always it stood out and was distinguished sharply from the rest, while tinctured by the dumb, aloofly unsurprised and unsurprising quality of all its fellows. It possessed, too, an urgently prophetic or premonitory character and clumsy force they did not share. It was as if something loomed and lowered, as if he were drawing into the shadow of something. The hem of the shadow had already touched him, and the vision, that easy and repeated scene of brook and garden and church spire, which all his life seemed unobtrusively but constantly to have companioned him, half recognized from afar, was within whispering distance, suddenly insistent, warning him. It spelled extinction and annihilation, death. How this peculiar conviction grew on him he could not say. Logically it was absurd. The innocent components of the picture were certainly not such in themselves as to excite alarm, yet their combined effect was one of dire repugnance and affright. Why? The thing had an odd, boding wistfulness, the shock and the mute, sickening kick of some enormity or hideous catastrophe at which the chance beholder can but gaze in a shamed fascination, white-faced and appalled. Perhaps, after a fashion that he could not analyze, it reminded him of something painful he had otherwise succeeded in consigning to oblivion, some sight and moment of supreme agony or fear that he had long ago experienced, and might experience again. Yes, that was it. Again. Insensibly, his trouble was assuming clearer shape. His neural-hued but terror-dyed and horror-waking motif, interpreted in terms of personal disaster, became more definitely and explicitly a threat. He must beware of it, of anything at all resembling it. Years since, he now remembered, he had amused or intrigued himself by supposing a man apprised, on some to him infallible and unimpeachable authority, and from some utterly, entirely reliable, unquestionable source, of the date and place of his death. What would the man do? Evidently, Geoffrey had decided then he would do his best to cheat his fate, to see to it that the place was never visited, or at all events that the date and place did not meet. And at first vaguely, presently with greater certainty of apprehension, it was borne in upon him now that this was his predicament. Beyondaril, this foolishly self-christened, dogging picture of a stream, a garden, and a faint church spire, was something he would look on at his peril. If he did see it, it would be all over with him, and his game and number would be up. From this it was a short step to the taking of precautions, to the ensuring, so far as was within his power, that he would not see, and the simple, obvious way of not seeing was just to stay right where he was, or at least in the streets and squares that lay around his home and that he knew. Not that he was unaware of the strangeness of his obsession, or that it was and could be only an obsession, or of the strict desirability of veiling it from prying eyes. October was here, and until Christmas he would be kept moderately busy. He was on the boards of 2 small plastic and engineering companies, and had conferences to attend, minutes to con, accounts to fuss over, check and sign. Life must continue in its accustomed manner, or must appear to. Since his wife's death, 10 years ago, he had fallen more and more into a routine, and the rather old-maidish regularity of his habits made it the easier now to go on as if all were as usual and nothing amiss. He splashed into his cold bath punctually at 8, breakfasted, played a round of golf if work allowed, perhaps another after lunch, dropped in, it might be, at his club, Mrs. Willows, he fancied, save for deploring his departed or capricious appetite, subscribing with a briskly businesslike and almost cheery commiseration to the fiction that he was just run down, and suggesting a holiday to wind him up, had observed no very ruinous change in him, or had remarked on none. The mirror, casting back his somewhat florid cheeks, large nose, small ginger-grey moustache, and smaller grizzling tuft of beard on an aggressive chin that complimentarily had been called craggy, showed him his ordinary self. No more, no less. Yet all the while, and everywhere, Beyondaril. The mere name of the thing, the mere lame, silly, chiming name, haunted him persistently and naggingly, like a wind sighing from a wasteland, faint with despair and boding. Over a brook, of course, was, he supposed, what the name meant, if one could characterize the mingy little trickle of water, hardly better than a ditch, in the scene's foreground, by any term so poetical as a rill, and the details sometimes altered. A diminutive, rustic bridge, normally spanning the streamlet, might be replaced by just a plank. The garden dwindle and degenerate into allotments. The spire retire to the horizon or draw closer. But constantly, and in whatever guise, his curious bane was with him, draining his strength and sucking at his will, sapping his energy and grimly, odiously hag-riding him. Inevitably he was subject to sudden awful frights, to every gradation of scare, from dim misgiving to sheer heart-cracking terror. He was always looking for this pedestrian but hateful combination of steeple, park and stream, and often imagining he saw it. Once he was towards the end of a morning round of golf with Briggs, a co-director on the board of Turbex. Geoffrey had been more wholesomely and mundanely worried that morning by reflecting that Mrs. Willow's solicitude showed signs of becoming too possessive, that she pitied too plainly his widower's loneliness, and probably had designs on him. In that case, nuisance and upset though it would be, he must not hesitate to send her packing. If she... Abruptly, his annoyance about Mrs. Willows faded. With a start of horror, he stood frozen, staring at something over the 11th green. There was an instant of appalled recognition, of what seemed recognition. Then, no, it was nothing. He had been mistaken, and it was just a false alarm. To the astonished Briggs, he had to pass off his goggle-eyed distraction as due to a turn of giddiness. Long before this, and naturally he had ransacked his memory for anything that bore even remote resemblance to his plague. He searched diaries, but they threw no light. Nowhere and never, to his honest knowledge, had he encountered that particular scene. If it were memory, then his memory was of the future. "Off your feed, eh?" said Latham, trivially. "I've told you, haven't I? You're thoroughly run down. Why don't you get away to, well, say to Brighton, or to Bournemouth?" No, there was no help there. And Brighton? Bournemouth? Geoffrey trembled. Why, what mad advice! Home was his safety, sanctuary and citadel. Or only there, actually at home, was he so much as relatively secure. Henceforward he would be more careful, far more, for the idea occurred to him with a sick spasm of dismay. It was quite fatally easy to see a thing, and not to realize till too late that you had seen it. How many in 1,000 could adequately describe the upper stories of the houses in the streets they walked through daily? Yet, in a sense, they had seen them. From now on he would hug his own domain, not leave the only shelter and protection that was his. A telegram arriving towards the middle of November and calling him to the deathbed of his Uncle James in Bristol was as disruptive as a bomb, shattering all that remained to him of peace or fortitude. Well, he was here, in Bristol, and no one, least of all his freshly widowed, always rather muddle-headed, and at the moment grief-submerged Aunt Sylvia, could guess the struggle it had cost him. Never mind that. He had come, and it was over, praise heaven, or very nearly. Uncle James had died on the 14th, and the funeral was 3 days later. The will, so far as Geoffrey could judge, would be satisfactory. Profit motive, eh? Yes, it still pulled. It had proved more powerful than he would have thought, though what good would money, any amount of it, be to him if this went on? But it would not go on. It had been sensible of him to stifle his obsessive qualms by sheer courageous stubbornness and strength of purpose, and the reward of pluck eventually would be worth it. Not to have responded as he had to Sylvia's request might have jeopardized a good deal, in convertibles and hard cash. A nasty codicil might have been added. He had to exercise prevision and see himself not as he was, but as he would be. Once he recovered, he would be glad that he had come. Nonetheless, he felt edgy and worn out. At corners, at unfamiliar crossings, he had literally shut his eyes in panic. And driving from the cemetery after the burial, he had pretty well lost all grip and all control. He had been impelled abruptly by an insane desire to leap from the broom and run blindly he knew not where. The final day especially had been martyrdom. Reluctantly prolonging his stay on the supplications of his aunt, he had done what he could to console her. In the evening, unwisely, he had taken a book from the dead man's library and read the frightful tale of Dupin's sister from the jail of Tongues. Eventually, scarcely an hour ago, and adamant to all entreaties to stop on yet another day, he had almost bolted. Thank goodness he had, and was on the train at last. For he could have stood no more of it, and Beyondaril, the thing, his incubus, was still there, pursuing him, inside him, with him, sometimes merely irksome, but sometimes agonizing, like a message of doom, a forlorn summons breathing from the grave. No use trying to delude himself that it was any better. Yet, it was as bad as ever, inescapably crowding, pressing in on him. Down in the left-hand lower corner, something new was happening. A whitish blur had come into the picture and was slowly spreading upwards. Why couldn't the train go quicker? He longed for the safety, the comparative safety of London and of Bayard's Close. Paddington, he jumped into a taxi. Marylebone, the Euston Road, then northwards through Holloway. It was about 3, and the day was wan, the streets suffused with a cold gilt, though the sky itself was the colour of dirty tin. Oh, hurry, hurry! The taxi driver, damn him, had made an unnecessary detour and, with a surly air, had pulled open the little front window and was asking the way. Geoffrey peevishly re-informed him and leaned back again, panting slightly. Presently the taxi stopped once more. Oh, this was intolerable. The man was a fool. They were nearly there now, but Geoffrey was so exasperated that he hopped out with his suitcase, paid the fellow off, and began to walk the remaining couple of 100 yards. At last, his heart pounded, and the suitcase likewise had all at once become as lead. But he had only a step or two to go. Here was the adjoining close, St. Leonard's. He staggered on. Just a few seconds now, and... Why, what was this? Something was wrong. Was very wrong indeed. He halted, his legs suddenly weak and terror-clogged. The thing, Beyondaril, stole over him, was face to face with him. Beyondaril, yes, it was here. All the time it had been here. During his week of absence, the big hoarding had been removed, and he could see the spire, the brook, and the allotments. All the time, Beyondaril. It was his own home. About the posts that had supported the screen, a small gang of labourers was still busy. Two of them ran forward as Geoffrey fell, and the first to reach him put a hand to the crumpled figure's chest, and then looked blankly up at his mate, shaking his head. Today's story was Beyondaril by John Metcalfe. It was read by me, Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.